The engine roared to life, growled with a raw and guttural fury that filled every corner of the garage, and then died. Not with a sputter or a cough, but with a sudden, total silence that felt almost personal, as if the car itself had decided, once again, to refuse. Victoria Hayes sat behind the wheel of the Ferrari, with both hands gripping the leather so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. And she did not move. She did not curse. She did not cry. She simply sat there in the silence of her climate-controlled, museum-grade garage, surrounded by $3.5 million worth of machinery, and she breathed. 5 years. 5 years of specialists flown in from Stuttgart and Maranello and Tokyo. 5 years of invoices that totaled over $3 million. 5 years of engineers who came with PhDs in precision tools and unshakable confidence, and left with their reputations slightly diminished and their certainty completely destroyed. Not one of them had fixed it. Not one had even come close. She remembered the last man they'd called, a retired Formula One engineer named Gregory, who'd spent 6 days with the car before flying back to his home in Monaco with a check for $80,000 and a note that read simply, "The vehicle presents no identifiable mechanical fault. I cannot help you." She had framed the note. Not out of bitterness, though there was some of that. She'd framed it because it was, in its own bizarre way, honest. The Ferrari was not broken in any way that made sense to anyone who looked at it. It started some days. It refused others. It ran smoothly for 40 miles, and then cut out without warning at highway speed. It idled perfectly in the cold and seized in the heat. It passed every diagnostic test ever devised by human or computer, and then betrayed every result the moment someone actually tried to drive it. The car was beautiful and maddening and completely inexplicable, and it had consumed 5 years of Victoria's life because she could not let it go. Because letting it go meant letting go of the last thing her father had ever given her. Richard Hayes had been many things in his life. He had been a difficult man and a devoted father, a ruthless negotiator, and a surprisingly tender grandfather to the children of people he loved. A man who never apologized but always made things right in the end. He had built a semiconductor company from a rented warehouse in Ohio into an enterprise worth $2.4 billion. And when he handed leadership of that company to his daughter 3 years before he died, he had done it without ceremony or sentimentality, pressing the keys into her palm over dinner as though he were passing her the salt. But the Ferrari, a 1984 Ferrari 328 GTS, cherry red with a tan leather interior and a gear shift that snicked into place, with a precision that bordered on the sensual, the Ferrari he had given to her with both hands and wet eyes, and a voice she had never heard from him before. "When you drive this car," he'd said, "remember that I'm still with you. This engine is my heartbeat. As long as it runs, I'm not gone." He had died 4 months later, and 3 weeks after the funeral, the Ferrari had stopped running. Logically, Victoria knew the timing was coincidence. She was a woman of data and systems, a CEO who had tripled her father's company in value through rigorous analysis and disciplined decision-making. She did not believe in signs. She did not believe in the kind of sentimental magic that made grief feel meaningful instead of random. But she could not shake the feeling quiet and persistent as a splinter that fixing the car meant something beyond the mechanical, that if she could bring it back to life, something of her father would return with it. She knew it was irrational. She pursued it anyway. There had been a therapist, 2 years in, who had gently suggested that the Ferrari had become a container for her grief. A way of keeping the loss manageable by keeping it attached to a problem she could theoretically solve. Victoria had nodded and said that was very insightful and had not returned for a third session. She preferred the container. It was hers, and no one had yet given her a reason to put it down. The latest round of specialists had concluded 3 months ago, and she had given herself this final morning to sit in the driver's seat before she did the thing she'd been avoiding, before she accepted that it was simply over. But then Marcus had knocked on the garage door and said 7 words that made her pause. "There's one more call you should take." Marcus had a gift for understatement. He delivered difficult information in the same tone he used to relay lunch orders, which was either a character flaw or a professional virtue depending on how you looked at it. Victoria looked at him from behind her desk and waited. He was holding a printed article, which he set down in front of her with the careful placement of someone presenting evidence. The headline had run in a regional paper, buried on a Tuesday morning, in the technology section between an article about electric vehicles and a human interest piece about a restored Route 66 diner. Local mechanic solves impossible BMW engine fault that stumped 3 dealerships. It wasn't the kind of story Victoria normally noticed, but Marcus had noticed it. And Marcus had a gift for finding things that mattered in places no one thought to look. So when the call came in from a garage in Millhaven, a town 53 miles north of the city that Victoria had never had any reason to visit, she almost dismissed it. The man who called identified himself as Ethan Carter, said he'd heard about the Ferrari through a friend of a friend, said he'd like to take a look. His voice was calm and unhurried, and entirely without the performance of expertise that she'd grown weary of hearing. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She told Marcus to set something up for the following Thursday and went back to her quarterly projections. But that night, lying awake in the dark, she thought about a man she'd never met, calling about a car no one could fix, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt curious. Ethan Carter woke at 5:15 on Thursday morning, the same as every other morning, to the sound of his alarm and the competing sound of his daughter Lily, already moving around in the kitchen below. Lily was 12 and lived with the cheerful relentlessness of someone who had decided, consciously or not, that joy was a personal responsibility. She made oatmeal with brown sugar and set a cup of coffee on the counter for her father without being asked, the way she always did, and she looked up from her breakfast when he came downstairs still buttoning his flannel shirt and said, "Today's the Ferrari day." It wasn't a question. She'd seen the news clip on the laptop the night before, had leaned over his shoulder with her chin resting on his head the way she'd done since she was small enough for it to make physical sense, and said, "Dad, can you fix it?" And he had said, as honestly as he knew how, "I don't know, Lil. I really don't." But she had already made up her mind about it, the way she made up her mind about most things quickly, thoroughly, without the complicated interference of doubt. Ethan Carter did not have an engineering degree. He had 2 years of community college, a certification from a vocational program, and 20 years of doing the work every single day in a garage that he'd bought when he was 27 with a loan he'd paid off 2 years ago. The garage was not impressive. It had 2 bays, good lighting, a lift that needed its hydraulic fluid changed every 6 months, and a reputation, not broad, but deep among people who drove complicated cars and expected the truth instead of a bill. His wife, Sandra, had gotten him the first set of diagnostic tools he'd ever owned as a birthday gift before Lily was born. Before the accident that took her when Lily was 4, he still used those tools. He kept them cleaned and calibrated and stored in the same order she'd placed them in the original case, because some things you maintain, not because they need it, but because the maintaining is its own kind of memorial. He loaded them into the truck that morning, told Lily to have a good day at school, and drove north on the highway with the windows down and the radio off. He'd done some reading the night before. Not about the Ferrari specifically, there wasn't much to read beyond the headlines, but about the general category of intermittent fault in high-performance electronics, which was a category he'd spent a considerable amount of time with over the years. Intermittent meant it happened, and then it didn't. It meant that by the time you looked for it, it was gone. Which meant most diagnostic systems came back clean, which meant most technicians chased phantoms and called it an unsolvable mystery. Ethan didn't believe in unsolvable mysteries. He believed in problems that hadn't been looked at correctly yet. It was a distinction that had served him well. He had printed out 3 technical papers on ECU fault patterns and read them at the kitchen table after Lily went to sleep, with a cup of tea going cold beside him, making notes in the margins in the same cramped handwriting he'd used since high school. By midnight he had a theory. It was incomplete and possibly wrong, but it was a direction, and a direction was more than he'd needed to start. The gate to Victoria Hayes's property was the first sign that this was a different kind of appointment. The security guard who met him at the intercom had the practiced blankness of someone paid to notice everything and display nothing, and he looked at Ethan's truck, a 12-year-old Ford with a cracked passenger side mirror and a Millhaven Auto Care decal that had been on there so long it was starting to peel at one corner with an expression that communicated, without words, a series of reservations. He checked the appointment list twice. He made a phone call. He directed Ethan around to a side entrance rather than the main drive, which was information in itself. When he walked into the garage, one of the technical staff, a young man in a pressed shirt who introduced himself as Derek and had the body language of someone who had been waiting to be unimpressed, looked at Ethan's tool case and said, with barely concealed condescension, "We have full diagnostic equipment on site." "You probably don't need those," Ethan said, "Thank you," and kept carrying them. He set the case down near the Ferrari, with the same unhurried ease he used for everything, opened the latches, and began laying out his tools in the order he always used them, not because anyone was watching, not because the order mattered to anyone else, but because he'd developed the habit when he was 22 and learning that consistency was its own form of competence. Victoria came out to the garage 15 minutes after he arrived. He had expected someone who looked like a CEO, and instead got someone who looked like a person genuinely, visibly tired in a way that expensive clothing couldn't quite cover. She was tall and dark-haired, mid-30s, with the kind of composure that he associated with people who'd been holding something heavy for a very long time and had gotten used to the weight. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, which he didn't mind. He was used to being assessed. He was not the kind of man who inspired immediate confidence in people who expected their confidence to come from credentials. She said, "You're Ethan Carter." He said, "I am." She said, "You have one shop, 2 employees, and no certifications that would qualify you to work on a Ferrari under the manufacturer's guidelines." He said, "That's accurate." She looked at him for another moment. "What makes you think you can do what 12 specialists couldn't?" Ethan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then he said, "I don't think I can. But I'd like to find out." Something in her face shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile. Something smaller and more real than a smile. "Everyone else told me they could fix it," she said. There was something in her voice that was not quite bitterness and not quite sadness, more like the particular exhaustion that comes from hoping too many times. "They came with confidence. They left without it. I noticed that," he said. It didn't seem to help. He looked at the car for a moment rather than at her. Confidence is useful for starting a job. It's not always what finishes it. She studied him for a moment, and then she did something she had not done with any of the previous 12 specialists. She stepped aside and gestured toward the garage. She let him look at the car without hovering over his shoulder, without timers running in her mind. She let him begin. What he did for the first hour was nothing that the specialists would have recognized as work. He didn't open a laptop. He didn't attach cables or run protocols. He walked around the Ferrari slowly, the way he walked around any car he didn't know yet, building a picture of it from the outside in. He crouched at the front and looked at the way the hood sat on its hinges. He opened the engine compartment and stood there for a long moment without touching anything. Just looking. He put his hand flat on the engine block the way you'd put your hand on someone's forehead to check for fever. He got in the driver's seat, not to start it but just to sit there, and he looked at every gauge and switch and surface the way you look at a room you're going to have to describe later. He was listening, though there was nothing yet to hear. He was letting himself become familiar, which was a different thing from diagnosing. Diagnosis came later. Familiarity came first. Derek, the technical assistant, had been watching from near the door with his arms crossed. And after about 45 minutes he walked over and said, "Are you going to actually run the diagnostic?" Ethan said, "Not yet." Derek said, "We have a Canvas interface that can pull every code the car has ever thrown. It takes about 20 minutes. Ethan said, "I know. I'll use it later." Derek stood there for another moment, and then went back to his post near the door. Victoria had said almost nothing. She'd pulled a stool near the workbench on the far side of the garage and was watching Ethan with an expression that had moved from polite skepticism to something more attentive. She wasn't used to waiting. She ran a company that processed 11,000 decisions a day, and she'd built her life around the principle that time was not a renewable resource. But something about the way this man moved, unhurried, deliberate, focused, made her reluctant to interrupt. It reminded her, though she couldn't have said why, of her father. Richard Hayes had also moved that way, as if the world could wait, and was better for waiting. After his second hour with the car, Ethan said, "Can I see the service history? Not the summary, the full records. Every service visit, every invoice, every report, going back as far as they had." Victoria sent Marcus for the binders, and there were 4 of them, 3 inches thick each, arranged in chronological order, with the care of someone who believed that records mattered, and that the truth was usually in the details, if you were willing to look. Ethan sat down on the concrete floor of the garage with his back against the Ferrari, and read through them methodically, starting from the earliest. It took him another hour. No one spoke. At one point, Victoria had gone inside for coffee and come back to find him still reading. One binder finished and set aside. The second open across his knees. She set a cup on the floor near him without comment. He said, "Thank you," without looking up. She sat back on her stool. The afternoon light was coming through the high windows at a long angle, pulling long gold rectangles across the concrete floor. For the first time, in a very long time, she was not thinking about quarterly projections. He found the anomaly in the third binder. It was not dramatic. It was a single line in an upgrade invoice from 5 years and 2 months ago, 3 weeks before the first recorded fault. ECU, firmware update performance calibration, V7.2, installed per owner request. He read the line twice. He turned back 1 page, and then forward 2 pages. He set the binder down and sat quietly for a moment, and then he said, not to anyone in particular, not as an announcement, just as a thought spoken aloud in a quiet garage, "I don't think the problem is in the engine." The room had shifted without his noticing. 4 members of the technical staff had drifted in during the afternoon, and were now arranged near the door. And all of them looked at each other when he said this. And then one of them, not Derek, an older man, who'd been introduced as the lead systems engineer, let out a breath that was not quite a laugh but was not a laugh either. Victoria looked at them. Then she looked at Ethan. "What do you mean?" she said. He held up the binder, pointing to the upgrade invoice. "This firmware update," he said. "Was it done at a Ferrari-certified facility?" She didn't know. She got Marcus on the phone. The answer came back in 6 minutes. No. It had been done at a specialist audio and electronics shop downtown that also handled performance upgrades for high-end vehicles. They had since closed. Their records no longer existed. Ethan spent the next 3 hours taking apart the dashboard. He had told the room what he needed: good light, quiet, and the service manual from the original build year, which Marcus tracked down in PDF form in under 4 minutes, using a database that Victoria paid several $1,000s a year to access. No one asked if they could help. There was something about the way Ethan worked that made helping feel like interrupting. And the room seemed to understand that, instinctively. He was precise and unhurried about it, documenting each step, setting components aside in the order they came off. The technical staff watched in uncomfortable silence. Derek had stopped making comments. Victoria had stopped pretending to check her phone. What emerged from behind the dashboard, once Ethan had worked his way through to the central control module, was a small black box roughly the size of a paperback novel, covered in connectors and heat management fins that controlled the communication between the ECU, the engine management system, and the car's primary data bus. It was not a Ferrari original component. It was an aftermarket performance module, installed as part of the firmware upgrade, and on its side, barely visible without a flashlight, was a configuration label with a parameter code. When Ethan looked it up in the reference manual he'd pulled out of his toolbox, corresponded to a different vehicle model entirely, not a Ferrari 328. A Ferrari 348, which had a different engine management profile, a different RPM threshold ceiling, and critically, a different set of thermal operating parameters. The module wasn't broken. The module wasn't failing. The module was working perfectly. doing exactly what it had been configured to do for the wrong car. Under certain temperature conditions, usually when the ambient temperature rose above 78 degrees, or when the engine had been running for more than 20 minutes, the module sent a thermal shutdown signal to the engine management system based on parameters that didn't apply to this engine, and the engine obeyed. It cut out. Cleanly. Without error codes. Because there were no error codes to throw. As far as the car's systems were concerned, the car was behaving correctly. It was just being correct about the wrong vehicle. Victoria stood at the edge of the workspace and looked at the small black module in Ethan's hand. "That's it?" she said. "That's all it is?" He looked at her steadily. "I think so," he said. "But I want to be clear, I'm not certain until I've recalibrated it and tested it under the right conditions." She said, 5 years, $3 million, 12 specialists. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. The truth was unglamorous. The people who'd looked at the car had looked at the things that usually break. They'd looked at spark plugs and fuel injectors and timing belts and coolant systems and oxygen sensors and everything else that went wrong on high-performance engines. No one had looked at a firmware upgrade from 5 years ago because no one had been told about the firmware upgrade. And no one had asked, because when you are a world-renowned specialist and you have been hired to examine an engine, you examine the engine. You don't audit the owner's service history back 5 years looking for a technician who no longer exists, who installed a module set to the wrong specifications. That kind of thinking was not in the specialist's toolkit. It was in Ethan's toolkit because he'd learned, over 20 years, that the answer was almost never where everyone expected to find it. He recalibrated the module. It was a 3-hour process, delicate and methodical, requiring 2 laptops running simultaneously and a reference specification set that he'd downloaded to a flash drive the night before. The technical staff had stopped hovering and started helping. Victoria had stopped watching and started asking questions, real questions, specific and intelligent, the questions of someone who understood systems at a fundamental level and was simply unfamiliar with this particular one. He answered them directly, without condescension, which she noticed. It was nearly 9 o'clock in the evening when he finished. The garage was lit by the overhead fluorescents and the small task lights he'd set up around the work area. And it had the feel of a place where something important was happening, which was different from the feel of a place where something important was supposed to be happening. The difference was Ethan, and most of the people in the room sensed it without being able to articulate it. He reassembled the dashboard with the same methodical care he'd used to dismantle it. Then he sat behind the wheel. Everyone else in the garage held very still. Victoria was standing at the rear of the car, one hand on the roof, and she was not breathing. Ethan turned the key. The Ferrari starter caught. The engine turned over. And then, after 5 years of silence, after $3 million and 12 brilliant failures, after 100 mornings where Victoria had come into this garage and sat in the driver's seat and listened to the engine die after all of that, the Ferrari GTS ran. It ran cleanly and smoothly, and with the deep, settled confidence of an engine that had always known what it was capable of, that had simply been waiting for someone to understand it correctly. Ethan held the idle at 1500 RPM for 3 minutes, listening, watching the gauges, and the sound was exactly what it was supposed to be, even and strong and absolutely certain of itself. He let it run. Nobody moved for a long time. Then Victoria made a sound that she would not have been able to name, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something that existed in the space between relief and grief and gratitude, and something much older than any of those things. She put her face in her hands. Ethan cut the engine gently and got out of the car and stood a respectful distance away and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve the silence. When she looked up, her eyes were red and her composure was perfectly reassembled, which he found both admirable and a little sad. "I'm sorry," she said. He shook his head. "Don't be." She looked at the car for a long moment. "He told me that as long as it ran, he wasn't gone," she said. And it was not addressed to Ethan specifically, but he was the only one there. The technical staff had found reasons to be somewhere else. "Your father?" he said. She nodded. He said, "How long has he been gone?" 5 years and 2 months, she said. Which was, he realized, exactly how long the car had been broken. She seemed to realize it at the same moment, and something in her expression shifted not toward belief in the supernatural, because she was not that kind of person, but toward the acknowledgement that the timing of things sometimes carried its own weight. "The upgrade was done right after he died," she said. "I think I did it because I wanted to, I don't know. Make the car better. Make it more than what it was." Ethan said nothing. She said, "Instead, I made it stop," he said, quietly. "You can't make a thing better by changing what it fundamentally is." She looked at him then, sharply, and he wasn't sure if he'd overstepped. But she said, "No, you can't," and there was something in her voice that suggested she was thinking about more than the car. They had dinner at the kitchen table, because Victoria's housekeeper had left food, and it seemed wrong to send him away with nothing after an 11-hour day. The conversation that followed was not the kind Victoria usually had at her kitchen table, which tended toward business and projections and the endless operational logistics of a company with 4,000 employees. Ethan talked about Millhaven, about the garage, about Lily, about the way time moved differently when your world was measured in hours worked rather than quarters projected. Victoria talked about her father, about the company, about the particular loneliness of being the most capable person in most rooms, which she described not as a complaint but as an observation, the way a tall person might note that they couldn't find pants that fit. Ethan listened in a way that was different from how most people listened, not waiting for the pause where he could insert his own story, but actually tracking what she was saying, following it, letting it mean something. She noticed that. She found she kept talking because of it. He told her about Sandra. Not in detail, he was a private man, and some things had earned the right to be kept private but enough. He said she had died in a car accident when Lily was 4. And that there was a particular kind of damage that came from losing the person who was supposed to be there for the rest of your life, and that he had rebuilt himself slowly and imperfectly around the gap she'd left, the way a tree grows around a wound in its bark. Victoria said she thought that was a very precise description of what grief felt like. He said he'd had a lot of time to think about it. She said she hadn't allowed herself enough time for it. He said that was also common. The housekeeper had left pasta and bread and a bottle of wine that neither of them remembered opening. And when Ethan finally looked at his watch, it was past midnight, and he had a 45-minute drive home. He stood up and said he needed to get back, and Victoria walked him out to the garage where his truck was parked. And they stood in the cool night air for a moment, with the Ferrari visible through the open garage door, cherry red under the fluorescent lights, absolutely at rest. "Thank you," Victoria said. Not with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a transaction, but with the weight of someone who meant it entirely. He said, "You're welcome." She looked at the car. "What do I owe you?" He'd thought about this on the drive in and hadn't come to a conclusion, and he still hadn't. He said, $100 for the recalibration tool rental and $50 for parts. She stared at him. "The prize was $100,000, she said. "I know," he said. "I don't want it." She said, "That's absurd." He said, "Maybe." She said, "Ethan, I'm serious." He said, "So am I. I did the job because it was interesting. I didn't do it for the money." She looked at him for a long moment, in the way she'd looked at very few people in her professional life, as if she was re-evaluating a category she'd thought she understood. She wrote him a check for $5,800, which was a number she'd arrived at by calculating reasonable professional rates for 11 hours of specialized labor plus the part, and told him that if he refused to cash it, she would be genuinely offended. He folded it into his pocket without looking at it, and drove home on the empty highway with the windows down and the radio on. 3 weeks later, the article ran. It was not in a regional paper this time. A journalist from a national automotive magazine had heard the story from Derek, who turned out to have fewer reservations about Ethan than his early body language had suggested, and had called Victoria's communications team, and Victoria, after some internal debate, had decided to let it go forward. The piece was headlined, "The Mechanic Who Fixed the Unfixable: How Ethan Carter Solved a 5-Year Mystery That Cost a Fortune." It ran with a photograph of Ethan standing in front of the Ferrari, squinting slightly in the sun, wearing the same oil-stained jacket he'd worn the day he arrived. He looked exactly like what he was. The story traveled farther than either of them expected. By the end of the week, Ethan's phone had stopped being useful as a phone and had become a document of every type of person who wanted to reach him, from owners of troubled classic cars to engineers at major manufacturers to a television producer who wanted to discuss the possibility of a show about automotive problem-solving. Lily read him the messages at dinner every night with the bright enjoyment of someone who had always known her father was extraordinary and was pleased that the world had caught up. Victoria called on a Sunday morning, which was unusual for her. He was in the garage, which was usual for him. She said, "I'd like to offer you something." He said, "Okay." She said, "Not money." Or not just money. She had been thinking, she said, about expansion. Not his expansion necessarily, his decision entirely, but she'd been looking at the market for independent specialty repair shops, which was not her sector but which had structural similarities to several sectors she knew well, and the gap between supply and demand was significant. There was room for something. She wanted to offer her company's operational infrastructure, logistics, accounting, procurement networks, as a resource for his shop to grow on its own terms. No equity stake, no control. A consulting arrangement, structured as she saw fit, that would let him scale without having to navigate the parts of business that weren't his expertise. He listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "No." She was quiet for a moment. She was not accustomed to no, which she would have acknowledged freely. But she had anticipated it, which was what made this call different from the usual experience of hearing it. "Why?" she said. He said, "Because if I grow, I want to grow from what I've built. I don't want to grow from what I borrowed, even from you." She said, "That's going to be slower." He said, "I know." She said, "You're turning down something most people would spend years trying to access." He said, "I know that too." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then she said, "All right." And she meant it. What she did instead, over the following months, was nothing she could have been held to account for. She mentioned his name when people she knew complained about impossible mechanical problems. She forwarded the magazine article to her network with a brief note. Factual, unprompted, genuine. She did not interfere, did not direct, did not insert herself. She simply did what people with large networks do when they believe in someone, which was make sure the right people knew the name. The effect was gradual and then sudden. Millhaven started getting visitors from outside Millhaven, from the city, and then from places beyond the city. A collector from Connecticut brought a 1973 Porsche that 3 shops had refused to touch. A woman from Nashville shipped her late husband's Aston Martin. A wealthy retired surgeon from Phoenix arrived in person with a 1962 Jaguar E-Type and a personality Ethan eventually diagnosed as more difficult than the car, though both yielded to patience. The shop hired 2 more people, then 3. Ethan remained exactly who he was, which was the thing that made it work. He and Victoria fell into a rhythm of contact that neither of them named or defined, which suited them both. She came to Millhaven for the first time in November, ostensibly to drop off a car, a 1989 BMW, that her company's operations director had been meaning to have serviced for months, and which she offered as a patient rather than a reason. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon and met Lily, who shook her hand with the grave formality of a 12-year-old who had decided that adults deserved to be taken seriously, and then asked Victoria, with no particular transition, whether she found it hard to be in charge of a lot of people all the time. Victoria said, honestly, that she did sometimes. Lily considered this. "My dad says the people who find it hard are usually the best at it," she said. Then she went back to her homework, and Victoria stood in the doorway of the small office that adjoined the garage and felt, for a reason she couldn't entirely articulate, that she had been given something. She stayed for dinner. She stayed, in fact, until 9. Because Lily wanted to show her the constellation app she'd been using to identify stars from the back parking lot. And the November sky was very clear, and some evenings simply refuse to end when you tell them to. She went to the cemetery in December. She hadn't been since the first year. She'd told herself it was because she was busy, which was partly true, in the way that the most convincing self-deceptions are always partly true. She drove the Ferrari. She had driven it several times since Ethan fixed it. Always locally. Always briefly. Still half expecting the engine to cut out. It never did. It ran the way it had always been meant to run, which was with a confidence and authority that felt, behind the wheel, less like machinery and more like companionship. She drove the 80 miles to the cemetery on a gray December morning with the heat on and the radio off. And she pulled up to her father's grave and sat in the car for several minutes before she got out. The grave was simple. Richard Hayes had specified this granite. No ornamentation, name and dates, and a line from a poem he'd always loved. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. She stood in front of it for a long time. She told him about the car. She told him about Ethan, which felt strange and right at the same time. She told him she was doing better, which was true in a way it hadn't been for 5 years. And she thought about the relationship between fixing things and being fixed, which she was not sure she could have understood before this year. She stood there until she was cold, and then she walked back to the Ferrari and drove home, and the engine ran perfectly the whole way. She told Ethan about the visit on a phone call that lasted 2 hours, which was unusual for her because she disliked the phone and he was equally brief by nature. He listened in the way he always listened, and then said, "How did it feel?" She said, "Like something settling, like when you've been carrying a door slightly open and you finally just let it close." He said he understood that. She said she thought he probably did. They were quiet for a moment, comfortable in the way of people who have discovered that they don't need to fill every space. She said, "You know what the strangest part was?" He said, "What?" She said, "I didn't feel sad. I felt like I'd told him something good." Ethan said, "That's not strange at all." She said, "Isn't it?" He said, "You brought the car back. You kept your word to him, even if it took 5 years and some help." She said, "I didn't fix the car." He said, "No, but you didn't give up on it." There was a pause. "That's what he needed to know," Ethan said. "That you don't give up on things." 1 year after the Thursday morning, when an engine roared and died in a marble-floored garage, and Victoria Hayes sat in the silence with her hands pale on the steering wheel, she was in Millhaven again. The shop had added a third bay and a small waiting area, with good coffee and automotive photography on the walls that Lily had chosen herself. Ethan had taken on a protege, a 23-year-old named Danny, who had the same quality of patience that Ethan had, which was not something that could be taught but could be modeled, and Ethan was modeling it. The Ferrari was in the first bay because it was due for its annual service, and it sat under the shop lights with the patient grace of a car that has finally been understood. Victoria watched Ethan work on it from the doorway, drinking coffee, while Lily did math homework at the front desk. It was an ordinary afternoon in an unremarkable town, and there was nothing exceptional about any element of it except the feeling it gave her, which was the feeling of being somewhere that was exactly right. Ethan finished his inspection and closed the hood and looked up at her. "Still perfect," he said. She said, "I know." He looked at the car for a moment and then at her. And there was a particular quality to the look, warm and uncomplicated, that she had become familiar with, and that she still found she had to prepare herself for, the way you prepare yourself for stepping into sunlight after a long interior. She said, "Ethan, can I ask you something?" He said, "Sure." She said, "What do you think the best thing you've fixed is, in 20 years? He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. She could see him going through candidates in his mind. And she waited. And Lily looked up from her homework and waited too. Because she'd been listening, as she always was. He looked at the Ferrari. He looked at the window. He said, "Honestly, I think the best things I've fixed have always been things I didn't know I was fixing when I started." Lily said, "Like what?" He said, "Like people's trust. Like people's belief that things can get better." She wrote that down in her notebook, which made both adults laugh, though there was nothing funny about it. Victoria walked into the bay and stood next to the Ferrari, running her hand along the roof in the way she'd done 1,000 times in that garage and always found calming. She said quietly, almost to herself, "You know what the best thing you fixed wasn't the car, right?" He looked at her. She was looking at the car. She said, "I spent 5 years thinking the car was the thing, thinking if I could just fix the car I'd be okay. Have him back somehow. Not have him back." But she stopped. Ethan waited. She said, "What I didn't understand was that I wasn't trying to fix a car. I was trying to give myself permission to stop carrying it alone." She looked at him then, and I couldn't do that until someone showed me that the problem I thought was impossible just needed a different way of looking. He didn't say anything. She said, "So, thank you. Again. For the car." A pause. "And for the other thing." He said, "You're welcome. For both." Lily, from the front desk, without looking up from her notebook, said, "This is getting mushy." And the bay filled with laughter, the kind that rings off concrete floors and metal walls, and carries further than it has any reason to. And the Ferrari sat in the middle of it, red and steady and at rest, running as it always should have run. The afternoon light shifted toward gold. Outside, the town of Millhaven was doing the small, unhurried things that small towns do at the end of a workday. Ethan began cleaning his tools with the care he always brought to it, and Victoria sat on the stool near the workbench, the same kind of stool she'd pulled up in her own garage on the day they met, and she watched him, and Lily had given up on the pretense of homework and was taking pictures of them both on her phone with the unself-conscious documentation of her generation. They would look at those pictures later, in the months that followed, and they would look happy in them, in the way that people look happy when they don't know they're being photographed, which is the only kind of happiness that photographs well. Victoria would put one on her desk at the office, which her assistant Marcus would notice and not comment on, though he would smile about it. Ethan would let Lily print one and frame it for the office wall of the shop, next to the photo of Sandra, because some things belong together not because they are the same but because they are both real. The Ferrari ran. It would keep running. And in that ongoing, ordinary fact, an engine firing reliably, a car doing what it was built to do, there was something that defied the categories of mechanical success and business triumph and romantic possibility. Something that belonged to an older and simpler vocabulary, the vocabulary of things that come back, of patience rewarded, of the specific grace that arrives not when you finally find the answer. Richard Hayes had told his daughter that his heartbeat lived in the engine of that car. And for 5 years the car had been silent, and she had moved through the world, carrying that silence the way you carry a word you can't quite say. And then a man from a small town with oil on his jacket and a daughter who did her homework at the front desk had sat beside the car and listened to it, which is a thing that almost no one does anymore, simply listening, without agenda, without the noise of expectation, and in that listening had found the small wrong thing, the tiny miscalibration, the module speaking the wrong language to the wrong machine. Sometimes the thing that is broken is not the thing that looks broken. Sometimes the wound is not where anyone thought to look. And sometimes the person who finds it is not the person with the most impressive credentials or the most expensive tools, but the person who is willing to sit quietly with something complicated and give it the time it deserves. Ethan Carter was that kind of person. He had been that kind of person long before Victoria Hayes drove a Ferrari into his life, and he would be that kind of person long after, which was the thing about him that could not be bought or replicated or reproduced by the market forces that were now, slowly and inevitably, discovering him. He was simply himself, and in a world that had forgotten how valuable that was, it turned out to be worth everything. The work he did was not theatrical. It did not require an audience. It did not get easier or harder depending on whether anyone was watching. It was simply the same work, done with the same care. every single time, and in that sameness, that refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was, there was a kind of integrity that most people spent their whole lives reaching for. Sometimes, Lily Carter would write years later, in a journal that her father would never read because she would not show it to him. The most important things that get fixed are the things nobody could see were broken. And the best mechanics are the ones who know the difference between what something is and what it's supposed to be. She was 12 when she wrote that, which was too young to know it was true, and exactly the right age to understand it anyway. She had grown up watching her father work, had spent countless afternoons in the shop doing homework on the front desk, while cars came in broken and left whole, and she understood the job not as a profession but as a practice, the daily, patient work of caring about things that other people had given up on. She thought that was probably the most important thing a person could do. Outside the garage, the sky was going dark in the particular unhurried way of autumn, and the stars were beginning to arrive, and the Ferrari sat in the lit bay like a kept promise, and Ethan Carter cleaned his tools, and Victoria Hayes drank her coffee, and the sound of their laughter carried out through the open garage door and into the cooling air, and did not stop for a long, long time.